Wherever you find yourself this evening, in a lamplit room with the curtains drawn against the cold, in a carriage swaying north through country you cannot see, or in that last uncertain hour before sleep, when the mind refuses to lie still, permit me to ask you one small question before we begin. Do you remember the first mystery that ever kept you from your rest? The first locked door that would not yield to reason? The first stain that could not be explained away? Hold that memory a moment, for tonight I mean to give you another to set beside it. And should the signal falter wherever you are listening, know that the rest of these chronicles wait for you elsewhere, patient as they have always been. Now, to the matter. It was a morning in the wet November of that year, when the fog upon the West India docks lay so thick that a man might stretch out his hand and lose sight of his own fingers, and the great hulls of the moored steamers rose out of that grayness like the flanks of sleeping animals, dripping and silent. Aboard the steamer Corvana, 4 days home from Cape Town and not yet emptied of her passengers, a night steward named Pruitt went down the passage at 6:30 to wake a first-class gentleman for the early tide, and found the door of stateroom 7 bolted fast from within. He knocked, and there was no answer. He knocked again and called the gentleman's name, which was Crane, and still there was nothing but the small sounds a ship makes when the river breathes beneath her. At last, with the assistance of the carpenter, the door was forced, the old brass bolt tearing from its socket, and the 2 men stood upon the threshold and did not for a moment go in. Upon the floor of that little cabin, soaked deep into the seams of the planking, spread black at its heart and rust-red at its edges, was a great stain of blood, more blood than a living body can spare and still be living, and of Mr. Alaric Crane there was no trace at all. The porthole was screwed down and no wider than a man's head. The skylight above had been painted shut a decade since. The bolt they had broken had been shot from the inside by a hand that could only have been within the room. There was no cry heard in the night, no struggle marked upon the walls, no weapon left behind, and no body to be found upon that vessel, though every locker and bunker and coal hole in her was searched by nightfall. A man had bled his life out in a sealed room and then, it seemed, had walked through solid oak into the fog. I ask you to remember 2 things from what I have just told you, for they are the whole of it, and the person who contrived this business made only 2 small errors, and both are already in your keeping if you were listening. Remember the faint smell that Pruitt would later swear to, a smell of fresh varnish where no varnish had any business being. And remember the mark upon the floor, a shallow curving scratch scored into the boards in the shape of an arc, as though some heavy thing had swung upon a hinge it did not appear to possess. I tell you plainly, as I always do, that the one who did this thing is already among the names I shall lay before you, and has already walked past you in this account without your marking it, and that when the end comes you will wish to go back and read again from the beginning. That is the pleasure and the cruelty of these affairs. But to understand how a man vanishes out of a bolted cabin, and why, we must go back some days from that fog-bound morning to a very different room, in Baker Street, where my friend Sherlock Holmes sat in the depths of one of those gray lethargies that took him when the world grew too dull to be born. He had not spoken for the better part of 2 hours. He lay stretched upon the settee in his mouse-colored dressing gown, his knees drawn up, his eyes half closed, and upon the mantel the correspondence of a week lay transfixed to the wood by a jackknife, unanswered and unread. 3 times I had ventured a remark upon the weather and the state of the streets, and 3 times he had let my words fall into the room and die there. It was a condition I had learned to dread, for a mind of that caliber, denied its proper food, will turn inward and begin to consume itself, and I had seen where that road led, and did not care to see it again. So it was with something very near to relief that I heard, a little after 11, the jangle of the bell below, and then the tread upon the stair, uneven and hurried, of a man in the grip of a fear he could not master. Holmes's eyes opened. He did not move, but the whole quality of his stillness changed, as a cat changes when a bird alights beyond the glass. Our visitor, when Mrs. Hudson showed him in, was a spare and anxious gentleman of perhaps 40 years, dressed with the careful economy of a man who must appear prosperous upon a modest salary, his hat turned round and round in his gloved hands, his collar damp with the fog and with his own perspiration. He gave his name as Edmund Frayne and his occupation as the London agent of the Cape and Southern Steam Packet Company, and he had scarcely taken the chair I offered before the words came pouring out of him in a flood he seemed powerless to stem. A gentleman had been lost, he said, lost in a manner that admitted of no natural explanation, aboard one of the company's vessels lying at that hour in the docks, and if it came out, if the newspapers took hold of it, the line was ruined, for who would book passage upon a ship that swallowed her passengers whole? Holmes lifted one hand, and the flood ceased. In a voice grown suddenly languid and precise, he asked our visitor to begin at the beginning, to omit nothing, however trivial, and above all to distinguish, as he spoke, between what he had himself observed and what had merely been reported to him, and Mr. Frayne, thus disciplined, told us the tale I have already laid before you, the bolted door, the great stain, the vanished man, and told it well, so that even Holmes's languor thawed by degrees into attention. When it was done, he asked but a handful of questions. Was the gentleman, Crane, a man of regular habits? He was, said Frayne, and of one habit in particular, for the stewards all remarked upon it. He bolted his cabin door each night without fail, and would suffer no one to enter while he slept, being, they said, a nervous man who had made enemies. I would have you remember that also, for it is the plainest fact in the whole affair and the most quietly deadly. Was anything taken from the cabin? Holmes asked. Nothing that could be told, said Frayne, for the man's effects were all in order, his watch upon the shelf, his money in his coat, his very cigar case open upon the table with a match half struck beside it. Holmes rose then, and I knew from the spring that had come back into his step that the case had taken him. He asked only that we might be conveyed at once to the docks in the Corvana, and that nothing further be touched, and Frayne, who had come in fear and now looked upon my friend as a drowning man looks upon a rope, agreed to everything. The cab bore us eastward, through streets that grew meaner and grayer as we went, until the fog and the river seemed to become one element, and the masts of the shipping stood up out of it like a drowned forest. The Corvana loomed above us at her moorings, black-hulled and streaked with the long voyage, and there was about her that morning a hush that no working ship should have, the hush of a house in which a death has occurred and no one yet knows what to do. We were met at the head of the gangway by the master, Captain Roderick Marsh, a great slab of a man with a red-seamed face and small pale eyes that moved restlessly from Holmes to me and back again, and I marked at once that his manner, which should have been that of a man aggrieved and mystified, was rather that of a man who has something to hide and is watching to see whether it is known. He led us below through passages that smelled of salt and coal and old smoke to the door of stateroom 7, which hung now upon its shattered bolt, and stood aside with his arms folded while Holmes went in. My friend did not go directly to the great stain, as I confess I did, drawn to it by that awful fascination such things exert. He stood a long moment in the doorway with his eyes half shut, breathing slowly, and I saw his nostrils widen, and he murmured, so low that only I could hear, that curious phrase, varnish, where there should be no varnish. Then he was down upon his hands and knees, his glass out, moving across the floor with the patient thoroughness of a man reading a page in a language only he possessed. The stain he studied for some minutes, and I heard him mutter that the blood had pooled and spread, but had not sprayed, that there was no violence in the pattern of it, none of the dreadful abandon of a struggle, but rather the quiet seeping of a wound, made deliberately and by a hand that knew precisely where to make it. Then he moved outward from the stain toward the inner wall of the cabin, and I saw him check and bend lower, and there upon the boards was that shallow, curving scratch of which I have spoken, a clean, bright arc scored into the old dark wood. Above it stood a heavy wardrobe of the ship's furnishing, bolted, one would have thought, to the very fabric of the vessel, and Holmes ran his fingers along its edges and behind it into the shadow, and when he drew his hand back and smelled his fingertips, his face was for one instant transfigured. As a man's face is transfigured who has glimpsed, far off and not yet certain, the shape of an answer. I watched him work and could make nothing of it, for to my eye the cabin told only one story, that a man had died there in the night and been spirited away by an agency I could not name, and the more I looked upon the bolted door, with its broken socket, and the little screwed-down porthole through which not even a child might have passed, and the painted skylight above, the more the walls of that narrow room seemed to close upon reason itself. Holmes, meanwhile, was examining the smaller things a man leaves behind him. He took up the cigar case from the table, open as Frayne had said, with the match half struck beside it, and he studied the burnt end of that match a long while under his glass, and murmured that here was a man interrupted not in fear but in ease, a man who had been about to light his last cigar in perfect tranquility when death reached him, which told us, he said, that the thing had come upon Crane without warning and without alarm, from a quarter he did not think to guard. He examined the bunk, the disordered coverlet, the pillow still bearing the deep impression of a head, and he remarked that the man had been struck down where he lay, or very near it, for the great pooling of the blood began at the bunk's edge and spread outward across the boards toward the inner wall, and not, as it should have done had he been standing and struggling, in the open floor toward the door. And then he was silent again over that curving scratch, tracing it with the tip of one long finger, following its arc from where it began, beneath the wardrobe's foot, to where it ended clean against the partition. As a man traces upon a chart the course of a ship that has passed and left no other sign. He said nothing to me then. He rose, dusted his knees, and turned to Captain Marsh with an expression of the blandest civility, and asked whether he might trouble the captain for the ship's articles, the passenger list, and the plan of the vessel as she had been built. And I saw the small pale eyes flicker, and the captain say, gruffly, that the plans were the owner's business and not to be had aboard. And Holmes bowed as though the answer satisfied him entirely, though I knew that it had told him something, for a man who has nothing to conceal does not trouble to conceal the plan of a ship. We spent the remainder of that short gray day in the interviewing of those aboard who had any bearing upon the matter, and it is here that I must set before you, as Holmes set them before himself, the several persons upon whom suspicion might reasonably fall, for the art of this business lies precisely in the sifting of them, and I will not deny that through that long afternoon my own poor judgment fixed first upon one and then upon another, and was wrong in every particular. There was, first, the captain himself, Roderick Marsh, and of him we learned, from Frayne and from the purser both, that he was a man deep in debt, that he had borrowed heavily against his next command and lost it at the tables, and that Alaric Crane, who was no mere passenger but a considerable shareholder in the line, had let it be known that he meant to see Marsh broken and put ashore at the voyage's end. Here was motive enough, and the man's furtive manner did nothing to acquit him, and I confess, I thought the thing as good as settled when I heard it. When Holmes pressed him upon the matter of Crane's threats, the captain grew first bluster and then, seeing that bluster would not serve, a sullen and watchful silence, and he admitted at last that he had quarreled with the dead man on the very evening before, loudly and in the hearing of the saloon, over a matter of the ship's accounts, and that Crane had told him to his face he was a ruined man, and that he, Marsh, had answered rashly that a ruined man had nothing left to lose. It was as damning a speech as I had ever heard fall from the lips of a man not yet accused, and I own that when we left him I was ready to see the darbies on his wrists before nightfall. Holmes only asked him, as we went, at what hour he had turned in, and Marsh said that he had kept the deck until 3, the fog being thick and the moorings treacherous, and that a dozen men of the watch could swear to it, and this too, upon the asking, was found to be true, so that the captain, like Kavanagh after him, was a man whose hatred was plain and whose opportunity was none. There was, second, the steward Pruitt, who had found the body, or rather the absence of it, and who told his tale with such a chalk-white face and such a trembling of the hands, that I could not decide whether I looked upon an innocent man frightened out of his wits, or a guilty one playing his part too broadly. He was the most obvious of them all, the man upon the spot, the man with the keys to every cabin in the passage, the man who might have entered while Crane slept and shot the bolt behind him and contrived the rest at his leisure, and I fixed upon him with a certainty that seemed to me proof against argument. He it was, I reasoned aloud to Holmes, who had discovered the scene, and it is a commonplace that the finder of a body is oftenest its maker, and he it was who had every means and opportunity that the sealed room allowed. Holmes heard me out with a patience that was almost pity, and then observed, mildly, that a steward's keys open a door, but do not shoot a bolt drawn upon the farther side, and that whoever had left that room had left it bolted from within, which no key in Pruitt's ring could have accomplished, and that in any case a guilty man does not tremble, so before those who have not yet accused him, for guilt learns early to wear a steady face, and it is innocence, ironically, that betrays itself by its terrors. He gave Pruitt, I noticed, the least of his attention of all of them, which I did not then understand, and only later saw to be the surest measure of my friend's judgment, for the man he most neglected in the questioning was the man he had most swiftly and correctly set aside. There was, third, a passenger named Kavanagh, a heavy, silent man of business who had come home from the Cape, a ruined creditor, ruined, it transpired, by the very Crane whose blood now stained the cabin floor, for Crane had lured him into a mining venture upon the Veld and then, when the shares collapsed, had bought them back for pennies through a nominee, leaving Kavanagh beggared and himself the richer. When we spoke with him, he made no pretense of grief. He said, with a terrible flatness, that he was glad Crane was dead, that he had prayed for it nightly, and that he only regretted he had not done the thing himself. It was the confession of an honest hatred, and Holmes listened to it with a grave courtesy and asked him where he had passed the night, and Kavanagh answered that he had passed it at cards in the smoking saloon until near 4 in the morning, in the company of 3 other gentlemen and the barman. And this, upon inquiry, proved to be exactly true. So the man who most desired the deed was the one man who could not have done it, and I began, dimly, to perceive the shape of the difficulty, that the sealed room narrowed the field not to the men with motive but to the men with opportunity, and that these were not at all the same. It was late in that afternoon, as the light was failing and the fog pressing closer against the ports, that we came at last, almost as an afterthought, upon the 2 persons who mattered most, and I set down honestly that neither of them made upon me the smallest impression, and that had you asked me a week later to name every soul aboard the Corvana, I might well have forgotten them both. The first was the ship's carpenter, an old gray-bearded man named Quill, who had served the line. He told us with a quiet pride, since before the Corvana was launched, since her keel was first laid down in the Glasgow yard, and who had helped Pruitt force the door that morning. He spoke little, and looked much at the floor, and when Holmes asked him, in a voice of idle friendliness, whether the cabins forward had always been arranged as they were now, the old man's eyes came up sharp for an instant, and then went down again, and he said only that ships were much altered in their fitting over the years, and a man forgot the half of it. Holmes thanked him with particular warmth and let him go. The second was a woman, and I am ashamed to say I noted little of her, but that she was past her first youth, plainly and darkly dressed, with a face composed to that professional stillness one sees in those who tend the sick, and that her hands, folded before her, were very steady and very capable. She was traveling, she told us, as nurse and companion to an elderly invalid gentleman in stateroom 9, the cabin adjoining Crane's, a Mr. Harburn who was far gone in some wasting illness and had need of constant care. Her name, she said, was Mrs. Aldous, and she was a widow, and she had heard nothing in the night, for she slept lightly and rose often to her patient, and her whole attention was given to him. She said all this in a low, even voice, without emphasis and without evasion, meeting Holmes's eye with a calm that I took, God forgive me, for the calm of a good woman, untouched by the horror around her. And it was only very much later that I understood I had been looking, across the width of a little cabin, into the eyes of the one person aboard who was entirely unafraid, and that in a ship full of frightened people, the one who does not fear is the one you must watch. Holmes asked her a very few questions, gently, as one speaks to a respectable woman in the presence of illness, and thanked her, and we withdrew. In the passage, he stood a moment looking at the closed door of stateroom 9, and then at the shattered door of stateroom 7 beside it, and I saw him measure the little distance between them with his eye, and heard him say, softly, to himself more than to me, that the whole of the matter lay in 3 feet of oak partition, and that he was a fool who had not seen it sooner. But he would not be drawn, and we went ashore into the dark and the fog, and the case, for that night, rested. It did not rest long. 3 mornings later, when Holmes had spent the interval in a silence, broken only by the sending and receiving of a great many telegrams, and by a solitary excursion I was not permitted to share, the affair took the turn that I had half expected, and wholly dreaded. A body had been taken from the river. The tide, working upon the mud of the Deptford Reach, patient and indifferent as the tide always is, had given up what had been most carefully committed to it, and there upon a slab in the mortuary, in the cold light of that low grey room, lay all that remained of Alaric Crane, swollen and marbled by his days beneath the water, weighted still about the waist with a length of chain and a firebar such as any ship carries in her stokehold, so that it was plain the river had not been meant to give him up at all, and had done so only by that perverse charity by which the Thames, sooner or later, returns almost everything that is given to it. I examined him myself, at Holmes's request, and with the coroner's leave, and I found upon his throat a single wound, small, clean, and precise, that had opened the great vessel of the neck, as neatly as a surgeon might have done it in the theater, with no ragged edge, no second stroke, no sign of any struggle or defense, and I said to Holmes that no common assassin had done this, that here was a hand that knew exactly where the life ran nearest the surface, and had gone to it without hesitation or waste. The hand, I said, of one trained to the body, a physician perhaps, or a butcher, or, and here I stopped, for I saw Holmes's eyes upon me, very still, and I understood that I had spoken nearer the truth than I knew, and that he had known it for some days, and had been waiting, with that cruel patience of his, for the facts themselves to lead me to the door. The wound, he said quietly, was the most eloquent thing about the whole affair, more eloquent than the bolt, or the porthole, or the vanished body. For a wound of that kind is a confession written in flesh, and it named the murderer's trade, if not yet the murderer's name. Here was the confirmation, if any were needed, that murder had been done, and done by no frenzied hand but by one that knew the body's secret architecture and struck once, exactly, without waste. And it was here, too, that the second thread of the business drew tight, for on the same morning the steward Pruitt came to Frayne in a state of collapse and let fall, before he could master himself, that he had seen something on the night of the death that he had not told, and that he meant, he said, to be paid for his silence, though he would not yet say by whom. The poor wretch had blundered into the most dangerous game a man can play, the game of selling silence to a person who has already killed to keep a secret, and Holmes, when he heard of it, came up out of his chair as though he had been stung. "The case has accelerated," he said to me, his eyes very bright, "and the game changes entirely from this hour, for we are no longer racing to name a murderer already fled, but to reach a frightened fool before the murderer reaches him, and I tell you, Watson, that our patient friend will not wait, for patience of that quality does not hesitate once it is threatened. It acts, and it acts within the day. He would not stop even to explain himself." He caught up his hat and his stick and was down the stairs before I had my coat, calling back to me only that I should bring my revolver and follow quickly, and that whatever I had believed about this business until that moment, I might do well to set aside, for the truth of it was very near now, and it was sadder than any of us had guessed. To understand what Holmes had done in those 3 silent days, we must go back over them, for he laid it all out for me afterward, and it was, as his methods always were, a matter of small true facts patiently assembled until they could bear the weight of a conclusion. He had begun with the captain's refusal to produce the plans of the ship, and had reasoned, rightly, that a man does not guard so trivial a thing unless it holds something he does not wish seen, or unless he does not himself know what it holds and fears to find out. So Holmes had gone, not to the captain, but to the source, to the Glasgow shipyard where the Corvana had been built, and had obtained by telegram, and then by a hurried journey, the original builder's drafts of the vessel as she was first fitted out, 20 years before. And there, upon the yellowed paper, was the answer that 3 feet of oak had hidden. Staterooms 7 and 9 had not always been 2 cabins. They had been built as one, a single owner's suite, joined by a communicating door in the partition between them, and only later, when the line refitted her for the ordinary trade and needed more berths, had that suite been divided in 2, and the communicating door sealed away, paneled over upon the side of cabin 9, and upon the side of cabin 7, hidden behind that great immovable wardrobe I have described. There was the arc scored in the floor, the swing of a door that had been quietly freed of its long imprisonment and opened upon its stiff old hinge. There was the smell of fresh varnish, laid on to disguise the marks of prizing and to ease the swelling of wood that had not moved in 20 years. And there, most terrible of all in its simplicity, was the whole impossibility undone, for Crane had bolted his own door, as he bolted it every night of his life, secure in the belief that no living thing could reach him, and had lain down to sleep, and death had come to him not through the bolted door at all, but through the wall at his side, through a door he did not know existed, from the cabin of the quiet nurse who tended the dying man next door. She had loosened the sealed door across several patient nights, working, Holmes surmised, in the deep hours when the ship slept and her patient slept, and no one thought to wonder at a nurse who kept late vigil, easing the swollen wood from its long-set paint a little at a time, oiling the stiff old hinge, and painting on fresh varnish to hide the marks of her labor and to quiet the sticking of the joint, so that when at last the night came she needed it. The door that had not moved in 20 years swung silent and free upon its arc across the boards of Crane's cabin floor. She had come through it in the small hours, in her nurse's soft shoes, and had stood over the sleeping man who bolted his door each night against the enemies he knew and never dreamed of the wall at his side. And she had done her work with the precision of one trained through long years to the body's ways, one clean stroke where the life ran nearest, so that there was no cry, no struggle, no spray of violence upon the walls, only the quiet seeping of a wound made by a hand that did not tremble. She had then drawn the poor drained corpse back through the partition into her own cabin, which was no light labor, and speaks of a resolution 12 years in the forging, had closed and concealed the door once more, and set the wardrobe back upon its arc, and had left behind her a bolted room and a pool of blood and an absence that no reason aboard could explain, and by day, when we came and questioned her among the medicine bottles at her patient's bedside, had folded her steady, capable hands in her lap, and looked me in the eye, and told me, in a low, even voice, that she had heard nothing in the night. When Holmes explained to me, on that ride to the docks, how simple the thing had been once the plan of the ship was known, I was ashamed, for I had stood not 3 feet from that sealed door and had seen only a wardrobe and a wall, and I understood then what he meant when he said that the eye sees only what the mind is prepared to admit, and that the whole art of his profession lay in preparing the mind to admit the thing that reason, at first, refuses. The body she had kept, God knows how, through the hours until she could commit it to the river, weighted and silent, from her own porthole at the slack of the tide. And the reason, the long and bitter reason for all of it, Holmes had found in a single line of an old newspaper, in the record of a ship called the Providence. We reached the docks in a fog thicker than before, so that the cab could go no farther than the dock gates, and we went the rest on foot, Holmes striding ahead through the murk with a certainty I could not fathom, I stumbling after with my hand upon the revolver in my pocket. The Corvana was to sail on the noon tide, her passengers already going aboard, and it was Holmes's conviction that the thing would be done before she sailed, that Pruitt would be silenced upon the ship, or upon the very quay, for a murderer who means to escape upon the tide cannot leave a talking witness on the shore behind. The fog that morning was a living thing, a gray tide of its own that had come up out of the river to meet us, and it swallowed the lamps upon the quay to dim brown smears and turned every passing figure to a shadow that loomed and dwindled and was gone, so that a man might have committed murder within 10 paces of us, and we should have seen no more than a movement in the murk. I heard the water lapping unseen against the piles below, and the muffled bells of the shipping, and somewhere the slow tolling of a buoy out in the reach, and over all of it the hush that fog lays upon a great port, so that the loudest sound seemed always to come from just behind one's shoulder. Holmes went through it like a hound that has the scent, sure of his direction where I had lost all sense of mine, and I kept close at his heel with my hand upon the cold weight of the revolver in my pocket and my heart going hard, for I knew now what we hunted, and knew that it did not frighten, and there is nothing in this world so dangerous as a quiet purpose that has already made its peace with death. We came out upon the wharf, where the great hull rose dripping into the grayness. its rows of lighted ports faint and yellow in the vapor, and there, in the confusion of embarking passengers and shouting stevedores and the white blindness of the fog, Holmes seized my arm and drew me into the shadow of a stack of crates and bade me be still and watch. And presently, out of the crowd, I saw the steward Pruitt come hurrying, his face haggard, glancing behind him as a hunted thing glances, making for the edge of the quay where a lower gangway gave onto the water, and I saw, following him at a little distance with the unhurried steadiness of the truly dangerous, a plainly dressed woman carrying a nurse's bag, and I knew her, though I had scarcely marked her before, for Mrs. Aldous of Stateroom 9. It happened very fast then, as such things do. Pruitt halted at the quay's edge where the fog hung over the black water, and she came up beside him as though to speak, and I saw her hand go into the bag, and I heard Holmes's voice ring out across the wharf, sudden and terrible in that muffled world, calling not the name Aldous, but another name, calling out Charlotte Verrall, and the woman went utterly still, and the hand came out of the bag empty, and she turned to face us as we came out of the shadows, and upon her white, composed face there was not fear, nor even surprise, but something that I can only call relief. The relief of one who has carried a great weight for a very long way and is at last permitted to set it down. She did not run, and she did not deny it. She stood upon the edge of the quay with the fog moving about her and the black river breathing below, and when Holmes told her, quietly, that he knew, and how he knew, of the sealed door and the varnish and the arc upon the floor, of the wound made by a hand that knew the body, of the providence and the name she had buried, she listened to it all with that same terrible steadiness, and when he had done she inclined her head as though he had performed some service for her, and then she told us the rest herself, in a voice so level and so quiet that it was the more dreadful for having no passion in it at all. 12 years before, she said, she had been Charlotte Verrall, and she had been young, and her father had been an engineer of the mines upon the Veld, an honest man, and she had been betrothed to a young surveyor, and both of them, her father and her love, had sailed home upon a ship called the Providence to raise capital for a claim that was honestly and truly rich. And Alaric Crane, who wanted that claim, and who owned a share in the line that owned the Providence, had known that the ship was rotten and unseaworthy and overladen, had known it and said nothing, had let her go to sea because it suited him that certain men aboard her should not reach England alive to tell what they knew, and the Providence had foundered in the bay with all souls, her father and her betrothed among them, and Crane had bought the drowned men's claim from their heirs for a song and grown rich upon it, and had falsified the inquiry, and had walked free and prosperous through all the years since while she buried her dead and her name together. She told us how the news of the wreck had come to her, a girl of 20 in a hot dusty town at the edge of the world, how she had waited weeks for letters that never came, and then read in a fortnight-old newspaper the bare list of the lost, her father's name and her lover's name set down among strangers as though they had been nothing, as though the sea had merely mislaid them, and how, when she went for justice, there had been none to be had, for the inquiry sat and heard the owner's men and the owner's surgeon, and returned its verdict of misadventure, and went home to dinner, and Alaric Crane, who had smiled at the back of the court in his good black coat, had walked out into the sunlight a richer man by the price of a dead man's claim. She had learned only afterward, piece by piece, from a dying clerk who wished to unburden his soul, how the Providence had been condemned and then sailed regardless, how the manifest had been altered, and the survivors' list forged before ever the ship went down, and how the whole rotten business had been contrived so that certain men should never come home to speak, and when she had the truth entire she found that there was no court in the world that would take it from her, 12 years stale and resting on the word of a clerk already in his grave, and so, she said, she had put the law aside as a thing that had failed her, and had taken the matter into her own 2 hands. She had trained herself as a nurse, she said, because it taught her the body, and because a nurse may go anywhere, into any house and any sick room and any cabin, unremarked and unremembered, and she had waited, and she had followed his fortunes across the world with the tireless attention of the thing that pursues, and when she learned that he was to sail home upon the Corvana she had found in a hospital ward, a dying stranger bound for England, a Mr. Harborne with no kin to trouble over him, and had engaged herself as his companion for the passage, and had taken care that his cabin should be the one beside Crane's, and she had studied the ship's old bones through the long nights of the voyage until she found the door that 20 years had hidden. And she had done, at the last, exactly, and without haste, the thing that she had come across an ocean and through 12 years of patience to do. She had not meant to harm the steward, she said, and it was only when she said this that her steadiness broke, for an instant, and something like grief passed over her face, that she had come near to killing a foolish, frightened man to guard a secret that no longer seemed worth guarding, and that she was glad, she said, glad we had come, before she became the very thing she had crossed the world to punish. There is a moment, in every such affair, when the law and justice, which we are taught to believe are one, are seen to be two, and to stand a little apart, regarding one another across a distance that cannot be closed. And this was such a moment, and I have never forgotten it. For here was a murderess taken red-handed, and here was Holmes who had run her to earth, and by every rule and statute the thing was plain. She must be given to the police, who were even then to be summoned, and tried, and in the fullness of the law's cold ceremony hanged by the neck until she was dead. And yet I looked at her standing there, this quiet woman who had suffered a wrong that the law had never troubled to right, who had avenged upon a monster the murder of 2 innocent men that the law had let pass as a misadventure of the sea, and I could not, God help me, I find it in my heart to call what she had done by the same name I would have used for a common cutthroat's work, and I saw that Holmes could not either. He stood a long while looking at her through the fog, and there was no triumph in his face, none of the keen pleasure with which he was wont to close a case, but only a great weariness and something very like pity. And at last he spoke, and he said that he was not the law, that he was only a man who found out the truth of things, and that the truth of this thing was that a greater murderer than she had gone unpunished for 12 years, and had at last met the only justice that had ever thought to seek him out. He said that the police would come, and that what happened between this moment and their coming was a matter for her own soul and not for his hands. And then he did a thing I have seen him do only a very few times in all the years of our friendship. He turned his back. He took me by the arm and turned us both away toward the dock gates, into the fog, and left her standing alone upon the edge of the quay above the black and breathing river, with the tide going out. We did not see her go. That is the truth of it, and I will not pretend otherwise. We walked away into the fog, and behind us there was a small sound, no cry, no struggle, no word, only a soft displacement of the water such as the river makes 1,000 times a day, and when the police came and the quay was searched, there was no one upon it, and the tide that had given up Alaric Crane 3 mornings before had taken back into itself the woman who had sent him to it, and neither the law nor the newspapers nor the anxious gentlemen of the Cape and Southern Steam Packet Company ever learned the whole of what had passed there in the gray November murk. The company had its silence, and asked no questions how it came. The steward Pruitt, cured of his greed by the nearness of his own death, held his tongue and kept his place. And Sherlock Holmes, who might have had the credit of one of the strangest solutions of his career, chose to let it lie unrecorded until I set it down now, long after, when it can wound no one living. He spoke of it only once, on the long ride home through the emptying streets, when the fog was thinning at last and a pale sun was struggling through above the river. He said that it had been a bad business, and a sad one, and that he took no pleasure in the solving of it. He said that men like Crane were the true impossibilities, not the locked rooms they hid behind, for a locked room could always be opened by patience and reason, but a man who had made himself rich upon the drowned and slept soundly ever after, that was a thing reason could open, but could not mend. He said that the most dangerous crimes were never the crimes of passion, the sudden blow struck in heat, but the patient crimes, the ones planned across years and committed without haste, whether by a woman who waited 12 years to avenge her dead, or by a man who let a rotten ship put to sea, and that the difference between the two, between justice and revenge, was the narrowest and the most terrible boundary in all the world, a line no wider than a hair and yet as deep as the sea, and that he was glad it was not his office to police it. He said that in his long experience the guilty who slept soundest were seldom those the law pursued, that the men who hanged were for the most part the poor and the sudden and the desperate, the ones who killed in an hour of drink or terror or want, while the great patient criminals, the ones who killed with a stroke of the pen or a word withheld or a rotten ship sent knowingly to sea, went to their clubs and their dinners and their long, comfortable graves, and that this was the one thing in his profession he had never learned to bear with an easy mind. He said that he thought the woman had died more at peace than the man she had killed had ever lived, and that, if there were any justice beyond the reach of coroners and courts, she would not be judged as harshly there as the law would have judged her here. And then he was silent, and I did not trouble him, and we came home to Baker Street through the clearing fog. So remember, when next you hear of a sealed door and a stain upon the floor and a body that could not be, that the answer is never in the walls or the bolts, but in some small true fact that cannot lie, a smell of varnish, an arc upon the boards, the steadiness of a hand that should have trembled, and that the person who is easiest to forget, the quiet one at the edge of the room whom no one thinks to watch, is very often the one who holds the whole of it. And remember, too, that the river keeps its accounts in its own time, and settles them at last, whatever the law may say. Wherever you are, whatever hour has found you here at the end of this, I thank you for your company in the dark, and I bid you go gently now to whatever waits beyond the lamplight, and when you are ready, another door stands closed for us. Another stain waits upon another floor, and I shall be here to open it. Until then, sleep, if you can.